Right, good evening, Life Leaders. That's the last thing anybody would want to happen in their lives. How would you recover when you lost everything in an instant? Maybe from a natural disaster or fire, just like what we have seen there, or worldwide financial crisis. Everything just crashes down. Death of your breadwinner, or you met an accident, or you're a victim of a crime, or your bank closed and you lost everything there, or you lost your job. Tragedy may happen to anyone. Of course, we can prepare ahead to some degree, but going through it still will be very painful, very distressing, and very disorienting. You do not know what to do and who can help you, who can rescue you, and perhaps how you can start again. This evening, we'll be talking about the David Saga Part 14, Strength to Recover and to Retrieve. David faced the same situation just like what we've seen in the video. He just finished dealing with King Shaul. God saved him from fighting his fellow Israelis when he was dismissed by King Achish of Gath. That was our study last week. And then so his men went home with him to Ziklag, and it took them 3 days to go home. They saw their town devastated. All their families and possessions were gone. No one was able to tell them what happened there. That was an unexpected thing to happen in their lives. If they came home earlier, they would have saved their place, and that would not have happened. Everyone was blaming David for what happened there. So how would David and the rest of his men recover? So let's study 1 Samuel chapter 30. We're almost at the end of 1 Samuel. I have 5 points to share today. Letter A, renew with the Lord's strength when in great distress. So we'll look at the first 6 verses first. So when David and his men were overwhelmed and overcome with emotions, instead of giving up and being afraid of his men, David strengthened himself in the Lord. What are we talking about here? Let's look at the story. Verse 1, David and his men reached Ziklag on the 3rd day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. So this was the surprising thing. So David was very relieved from being able to settle his difference again with Shaul and being sent home by Achish. But having this bad news was not a good thing for him to receive. David may not have expected the Amaleki attack, especially that he destroyed them in chapter 27, verse 8, our last lesson. So the surprising thing here was that the Amalekis were able to recover quickly and retaliate against them. You remember David was fighting the battles for the Philistines against the Geshurites, Gizites, and the Amalekis. Okay? And he would pretend that he would be invading Israeli territory, but instead he was fighting another kind of battle. Let's try to understand why the Amalekis have been a problem with the Israelis. Who are the Amalekis? We find in Genesis chapter 36 that the Amalekis came from the lineage of Esav. So we read here in verse 12, Esav's son Eliphaz also had a concubine named Timnah, who bore him Amalek. These were the grandsons of Esav's wife, Adah. Okay. So the descendants of Esav were the Amalekis. So the Amalekis were distant relatives of the Israelis. You remember Esav and Israel were twin brothers. All right? So they were all Semites. The next encounter that they had with them was in Exodus chapter 17. They just had left Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea. They sang a praise and song. They have journeyed through Elam and several deserts. They complained about the food, and God gave them the manna. They complained about water. God gave them bitter water for that. Now they're in Rephidim. Rephidim is just the next station before Mount Sinai. And remember, in Mount Sinai, this was the place where God and Israel had a covenant. This is what we know now as the Old Covenant. Verse 8, then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. Israel did not start this war. Okay, the Amalekites did because they were afraid of Israel. So what we can see here is that the Amalekites were the first people group that challenged Israel to a battle. Before this, they haven't been into a war. And they were very susceptible at this time. They were not prepared for a battle. So instead of pushing back, God helped them win the battle. You remember the story of Exodus chapter 17. Every time Moses would be lifting up his hands, they would win the war. When he gets tired, lowered his hand, they would be losing. And so what they did, Aharon and Hur kept his hand raised so that he would win the war. Right? And so this is what happened there. So they have been in conflict with the Amalekites for 200 years, from the time of the Exodus until the time of David. All right? They fought the Israelis when they were so very vulnerable. Verse 14 says, the Lord said to Moshe, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. So you see here, this is a war language. And war language is always hyperbolic. Just like in sports. Diba? They use, I will crush the enemy. But it doesn't mean that they're going to literally crush the enemy. They only had to subdue them to the point that they cannot fight back. While Yahweh promised to completely blot out Amalek in verse 14, look at what he said in verse 16. All right? Moshe said, because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against Amalek from generation to generation. So, do you think there's a conflict between verses 14 and 16? I will blot out, but then they will be at war from generation to generation. Right? So, it's hyperbolic language. It's an exaggeration. That means the Israelis have to prepare for battle for several years, several centuries against this people group. All right? They will be like a thorn in their flesh. Now, let's go back to 1 Samuel. Remember, the last time we talked about chapter 27 to 28. God condemned Shaul for not obliterating the Amalekites when he was ruling there. So, we didn't study 1 Samuel chapter 28 when Shaul consulted the witch at Endor and asked for Samuel for a word from the Lord. But let me just quote verse 18. Samuel said to Shaul, because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek, the Lord has done this to you today. So the Lord condemned Shaul for refusing to destroy the Amalekites. So that's why David continued that, because he's supposed to, as the king of Israel, to fight the battles against the Amalekites because they have attacked them at the worst time of their lives. So let's go back to chapter 27, verse 8. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshuris, the Girzis, and the Amalekites. From ancient times, these people had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. So David was carrying out the destruction of the Amalekites when he was still a subject of the Philistines. This was not utter destruction, as we will find in chapter 30, our study for today, that they will be able to retaliate against David. The Amalekites came out to fight back. That's what we have read in verses 1 and 2. The Amalekites attacked Ziklag, okay, and took all of their families and their possessions. Verse 3, when David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. This was the worst news that they could ever receive. They were at war, busy there, but then they have forgotten or at least left their families unprotected. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. This was really bad for them. David's two wives have been captured, Ahinoam of Israel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. So this was the biggest surprise of their lives. They did not expect that the Amalekites would be able to retaliate back so quickly. Verse 6, David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. They were blaming David for this. They could have done much better, at least to protect their families while they were away. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord. Wow. Now, you need to understand this. Even though they are men, okay, when you have lost everything, just like what we saw in the video, if that happened to you, you will be very disheartened. So all the men were emotionally distraught. Losing everything was too much for them to accept or to take it in. Something that your emotion cannot take. They cannot imagine how they failed their families and how they failed each other. Right? They took the responsibility, but then They were blaming David. You know, that's what happens when you are so hopeless and so distraught. You're trying to look for someone to blame. Of course, they looked at their leader. Now, what do you do when something terribly wrong happens to you? Just like this. Do you look for someone to blame to, just like the men of David? Or do you blame your leader? Do you blame yourself? Or do you blame God? So many people leave the faith, they blame God for a tragedy that happened to them. And some of them could not recover from it. Now, actually, this is really a test of faith. And that's what you need to understand when you're going through tough times. God is testing your faith. The faith should have been there in the first place. And David had that faith. So this was the greatest test David was facing so far in his life. So far. So how did David deal with this overwhelming loss? He found strength in the Lord his God. He didn't forget God. He didn't complain against God. He came near to God and sought for his help. Even though he was a great soldier and commander, he knew when in front of God, he needed his help. He drew near to God. He did not dwell in the negative emotions. He looked for solution. He knew that this could not be the end of his story. He has yet to become a king. He knew that God could lift him up again in this situation. Listen to this. God may allow you to lose everything. God forbid, but he does allow that. But he can give you strength that you need to rise again. I guess we're not the first Christians who have lost their homes in a fire or in a crime or in a scam. But God is able to raise up people who have been victimized by such bad people. Do you believe that? God can raise you up. Second lesson, seek the Lord's will before acting, before doing anything else. So we'll be looking at verses 7 to 10. Even though David was mighty enough to take revenge against the Amalekis, he inquired of the Lord first before his anger or the pressure of his men on him could take control over him. Now, if you keep on hearing the voices of men instead of the voices of God, you could make a bad decision. So keep your composure, pull away, get away from these people, and get to the presence of God. Pray on your knees. Let's continue the story. Verse 7. Then David said to Abiathar, the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. Abiathar brought it to him. We'll talk about verse 8 later. So as we noted before, David acted in fear when he ran for refuge to the Philistines. And we criticized him for that. He did not inquire of the Lord. Should I go to the Philistines for refuge? So this time, he learned his lesson. He went back to Abiathar and asked the ephod, asked the Lord for his take on his situation. So this time he did the right thing. So remember that in chapter 23, he actually did this before when he saved the town of Keilah from the Philistine invasion. When he did the right thing before, God guided him. When he didn't consult the Lord allowed him to make a mistake. And still, the Lord saved him from that mistake. But right now, he was asking the Lord. That's the right thing to do. He asked the Lord through the ephod if he could save them. God's will should be our top priority. Not pleasing men who are pressuring you, just like what David was experiencing. God's will should not be our last resort. When we are so desperate or when we have run out of options, our first action should be, Lord, help me. What is your will? Let me tell you, the Lord knows our troubles. And He waits for us to call upon Him. You may be crying out for the losses that you have, but God has some great things for you. Now, let me show you first the picture of an ephod. Remember this? The ephod is something that they put on the priest. So it has 12 gems that represents the 12 tribes of Israel. And aside from the 12 gems that represent the 12 tribes, there was also the Urim and Thummim. Exodus 28 verse 30 says, also put the Urim and the Thummim in the breastplate, the one that we saw in the previous slide, so that they may be over Aharon's heart whenever he enters the presence of the Lord. Thus, Aharon will always bear the means of making decisions. So that was the guidance. The Urim and the Thummim. They will give the answer. Okay? for the people of Israel over his heart before the Lord. No. Though the Urim and the Thummim was not mentioned in the passage, that's obviously understood because it was placed in the ephod. It is understood that God answered prayers or inquiries through the Urim and the Thummim. The Lord does not answer prayers anymore through the Urim and the Thummim. That was only for Israel, for a temporary means, and for that season only. Obviously, for a long time, the Lord has removed the Urim and the Thummim. So we should not sort of draw lots, yes or no. If this is God's answer, we don't do that right now. We have the Holy Spirit to guide us. He gives us wisdom in order for us to know the will of God. Verse 8, and David inquired of the Lord. He asked a question with a yes or no. Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them? Pursue them, he answered. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. So the Urim and Thummim gave a positive answer. So it's either let go or let's go. Let go is forget about it. Let's go and chase them. So David believed that he could still do something about the situation. However, he needed the Lord's permission first. Because if he didn't get God's permission, if he chases them on his own, maybe he won't succeed. He needed the blessing of God. He needed the accompaniment of God to go on a rescue mission for his family. So this is, of course, our advice for everybody. Go ask the Lord if restoration is a possibility. What I'm trying to say here is in this case, in the situation of David, it was possible. Well, of course, in our situation, it could be yes, it could be no. Right? So if God says no, let go, then learn to let go. But if God says, let's go, expect Him to go with you, you will be able to recover whatever you have lost. Right now, I'm praying for the same thing. I'm asking the Lord, should it be let go or let's go? My wife knows about it. I was so devastated last Wednesday. Lord, let go of it, or let's go. You can give it back to me. So while everything seemed to be lost, David believed that he can do a rescue mission. He was not giving up and letting go of their lost families and possessions. Because these are precious possessions, especially their families. Right? Okay, so just take a look at this map. They know where Ziklag is. So Ziklag is maybe in the middle. So there you go. So going to the western side, Habeshor Stream or Beshor Valley right now. So imagine this. They got a go signal from the Lord, so they started marching from Ziklag to the southwest. Imagine the mixed emotions of the people there. Imagine the anxiety they have. They were probably conflicted. They were angry and at the same time hopeful that this mission can be successful. They were distraught because they haven't got the blessing yet or the restoration yet. But they were confident that they will be able to restore everything back. Perhaps they were doubtful. You know, you can't take away those doubts. But they were also at the same time positive. We go through conflicting thoughts, right? They were worried and perhaps also excited that they will be able to see their families again, well and alive. They were nervous because this is going to be tough. But they were also pumped up. We need to get there now and rescue our families. They're waiting for us. They're hoping for us to rescue them. They were concerned of the welfare of their families, but at the same time, they were assured by the Lord that we will be able to chase them and save them. That they will be able to find them, their loved ones, and rescue them to safety. Right? Verse 9, David and the 600 men with him came to Beshor Valley, where some stayed behind. 200 of them were too exhausted to cross the valley, but David and the other 400 continued the pursuit. Now, probably the 200 that were left behind were the additional army that David had. Remember, he started with 400, right? When he was hiding in the cave. Then eventually 200 more were added to him. With David receiving a go signal from the Lord, he was able to restore his men's sanity and reorganize them as soldiers. We're soldiers, remember that. We're one army. And rejuvenate their faith for a mission impossible. Yeah. Yeah. While not everyone was strong enough, David understood that others cannot make it to the other side of the valley. He didn't condemn them for that. However, the mission had to continue. They had to find their families. See this, David was unstoppable. Either with the 600 that he had or only 400. He was not discouraged that he lost 400 men going to battle with him. Remember, he had 100 more than Gideon had. Gideon had only 300 and he still won the battle. So that's not a problem for the Lord. Right? So how did David encourage the remaining 400 to go with him, to continue the battle, to continue pursuing? I think it's because he got the strength from the Lord. How did David assured the 200 left behind, they'll be fine and they'll be back with the victory? I think again because of the assurance from the Lord. Third advice, follow the Lord's providence to fulfill your mission. They were going there, but they didn't know really where to find them. Maybe they found some traces of the marching of some leftovers from the plunder. We'll look at verses 11 to 15. Even though David was wise enough to make battle plans and emotionally angry enough to avenge for his people, David must be very angry, right? He was composed enough to see how the Lord would lead them to victory. Controlled pa rin yung emotions niya. When the Lord gave David the go signal, he was sure that the Lord will be with him and will provide him the means to win. Verse 11, they found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat, part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten any food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. So, what does this person have anything to do with our story? The Egyptian was the providence of God. That's why I noted in letters he followed the Lord's providence. The providence here was the presence of a foreigner left by an Amaleki. Who would have thought that when they left their Egyptian slave, that would work against them? Though the army were in a hurry to overtake the Philistines, they were still kind enough to help a weak man by providing him food. Eventually, he would be their guide to find the Amalekis and their families. Verse 13, David asked him, "Who do you belong to? Where do you come from?" He said, "I'm an Egyptian, the slave of an Amaleki. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. We raided the Negev of the Kerethis, some territory belonging to Yehuda, and the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag." Oh, that's our town. You see here, David found the right person to get some information for the direction that they needed. Perhaps that was the unexpected thing. Now, they could have reacted quickly. Aha, you're one of them. Kill him after feeding him. No. David was thinking right. Come to think of it, is it possible that God made that Egyptian sick so that the Amaleki master would leave him behind for David to find who would lead them back to them? I think so. What did David and his men feel about the information given by the Egyptian? Again, maybe mixed emotions. This is one of the guys who took our families, but at the same time, we needed him because we needed information to find our families. Did they want to kill him? Maybe. Did they regret helping him? Maybe not, because again, they needed the help of this man. Did David get angry with the Egyptian? No. Or was he encouraged that the foreigner slave can provide them leads? I think that's the answer. It's a yes. Verse 15, David asked him, "Can you lead me down to this raiding party?" He answered, "Swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them." That's what David wanted. The point here is that David kept a sane mind, a right mind, a sound mind. He knew that they can use this Egyptian to help them chase the Amalekis. Now, if you receive a bad report from a complicit person, you know what a complicit person is? Someone who's involved. When you say complicit, he's involved in it, in the bad act. Calm down. Calm down. Because sometimes when you see a crime and one of the perpetrators left behind because he got shot and everybody escaped, What do you do? Do you kill that person? No. You take that person, get some information so you can chase them. Right? You see, the Egyptian was ready to help upon the condition of immunity. Well, of course, if you're the Egyptian, you would also do that. This man helped me, and I don't want to be back to the Amalekis. I can help them if they would spare me. So that was a fair deal. You see, this happens all the time in our justice system. The least guilty can be turned into state witness. Right? Fourth advice, fight the Lord's battle until victory is achieved. That means go fight. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. We'll be looking at verses 16 to 20. Even though David had only 400 men to fight against the Amalekis, who held their people hostage, he fought them with care to avoid any casualty. Now, David and his men were getting closer to rescuing their families and retaliating against their enemies. Let's read verse 16. He led David down, and there they were, scattered over the countryside, eating, drinking, and reveling because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from Yehudah. David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day, overnight. And none of them got away except 400 young men who rode off on camels and fled. Some of them were so drunk that, or so caught off guard that they could not escape. The young men were still probably strong enough to escape. Well, come to think of it, it was good news for them to find them in the countryside. Now, where is this countryside? Actually, we don't know because the text doesn't mention to us, but it was a place where they could rest and revel. The Amalekis were thinking that this is a safe place for us to spend overnight. David and his men caught up with the Amalekis with their guards down. They were reveling. They did not expect that David would be able to chase them. While it was upsetting to see that their enemies were feasting upon David's losses, you would get mad. Now, there are families there and they're having a great time at the expense of our families. But it was also a good time for them to attack, to retaliate, and to recover their families and their possessions. So David did not waste any time. Again, verse 17, David fought them from dusk until the evening of the next day. So imagine how angry David and his men were at the Amalekis. They were perhaps merciless. They did this to us, to our families. Now we will be unforgiving to them. So imagine how they slaughtered them. Now, of course, I would not really want you to so much of it because, battle is ugly. War is ugly. Killing and all of those stuff with all the bloodshed, But again, this is war. This is how things were done way back then. So imagine how their families felt to see David and his men. Oh, here comes our men to our rescue. Praise the Lord. We will be saved now. We can escape. Maybe they were thinking, we will be held hostage by the Amalekis for several months. Remember, what happened in Israel? It happened in October 7, and up until now, there were still hostages in Gaza, even though many of them were already dead. So it's been taking them how many months now? It's been 10 months since that happened, and it's not over. In this story, it just happened overnight. The rescue has come. So imagine how relieved they were to see David and his men. These are our dads, our brothers, coming to our rescue. Just as when the night was coming. You see, the night was the dreadful moment. The Lord provided David the victory against the Amalekis. Their problem was solved on that very day. Well, actually, the war ended until the next morning. Well, it's still quite short, right? Verse 18, David recovered everything the Amalekis had taken. Whoo! Wow! Including his 2 wives, and they were not harmed. Nothing was missing. Young or old, boy or girl, plunder, or anything else they had taken. David brought everything back. Woo! Job well done. He took all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock, saying, "This is David's plunder." Because they were excited, right? Imagine this scenario. It is amazing to see how God preserved David's family unharmed. If you have a family member who hasn't been home for 3 hours, 4 hours, that would worry you. Where's my loved one? He hasn't been home. I'm expecting him or her to be home at about this time. It's been 2 hours. What happened? Right? You cannot fall asleep at that night. You'll be very restless. And you know our laws until, I think, 72 hours, if I'm not mistaken. If you're reporting a missing person, they will only look for the missing person after 72 hours, so that's about 3 days. You can imagine how the Amalekis could have hurt and abused his family. The most important thing there is the family of David. The Lord brought David and his men just at the right time before anything worse could happen to his family. If they were late, maybe some of their family members were killed and abused. Probably. But the Lord did not only preserve his family, but also his possessions. Wow. The Lord is so good, and he can do miracles. He took all the flocks and herds. So, their fears of what could have happened to their families returned to confidence that they could have them back. Their sadness turned to joy. Their tears turned to gladness. And their worries turned to celebration. When you receive an answered prayer, how relieving that is. You see here, once more, David became a great hero. Perhaps the most amazing victory David had ever had. He accomplished the impossible by the Lord's strength. It started then when David strengthened himself in the Lord. So if you don't strengthen yourself in the Lord, you won't get anything. You won't win the war. You won't have things back. Finally, share the Lord's victory for all to rejoice. So last 10 verses. Even though David was the leader and his men honored him for the victory, he was kind enough to share the loot and joy to everyone, whether they joined the battle or not. Feeling so relieved, David wanted to see all rejoicing in the Lord, and he wanted everybody to glorify and praise God. Verse 21, David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow him and who were left behind at the Sor Valley. They came out to meet David and the men with him. As David and his men approached, he asked them how they were. Oh, you see, David did not forget the 200 men who also lost their families, but they were able to recover them for them. They wanted to be a part of the rescue mission, rescue effort, but they were just too tired. David wanted to bring them the good news, and he was so happy to see them waiting there on the other side of the valley. Right? So look at how David met them. He asked them how they were. Kumusta kayo? Right? Instead of the men asking David how they were, of course, they saw everyone else rejoicing, so they knew the good news was there. But David was saying, how are you? Are you okay? You should be rejoicing. We're back with your families. He was concerned for the 200. He didn't condemn them. That's a sign of a great leader. A great leader understands that not all have the same strength, but everyone needs encouragement and everyone needs victory. Right? But all the evil men and troublemakers among David's followers said, because they did not go out with us, we will not share with them the plunder we recovered. However, each man may take his wife and children and go. Ah, that was unnice. You see this, the author anticipates for us the kind of people some of David's men were. They were evil and troublemakers. So that is already a sign for us that this was not good. They were selfish, they were unkind, they were rude, and they were inconsiderate. Do you think you're one of those people who doesn't want to share the victory of God to those who could not participate? Or are you envious of people who are experiencing victory in the Lord? Remember the Pharisees. They were not happy that the sinners and the prostitutes and the tax collectors were returning back to God. Imagine how disappointed the exhausted men were at the negative attitude the evil men had toward them. That was disheartening. David was in good spirits, but these men, they were not nice to them. See, David was happy to return the families of the exhausted men, while these people were turning the mood negatively. Verse 23, David replied, "No, my brothers, you must not do that. With what the Lord has given us, He has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party that came against us. Who will listen to what you say? The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is to be the same as that of him who went down to the battle. All will share alike." David made this a statute and ordinance for Israel from that day to this. David still called the evil men as his brothers. He was still nice to them. Brothers. He wanted to restore them to the right attitude toward the exhausted men. What if you were there? You were in their place. You're the exhausted one and you wanted to help but you cannot. And you would be met with such an attitude. He gave God the glory for the victory that they won. You were praising me for the victory, but it was God who has given us the victory. God gave them back everything they have lost. Even David's family, he said, God gave me back my family. It was from God. It was not from me. It was all by God's grace. So David wanted everybody to rejoice and benefit from the plunder. He blessed with the same goodness those who fought with those who failed to join. It's okay. We understand. But the blessing is also for you. You see, the story sounds like the parable of the laborers of the vineyard in Matthew 20 verses 1 to 17. You remember the story? Diba? I'll just read the 3 verses there. The master was giving their wages. Verse 14, take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I'm generous? So the last will be first. He's referring to the last people who came to the Lord, and the first will be the last. So the religious people were the first ones to come to the Lord, but they had a bad attitude. They thought that they deserved more reward from the Lord for being righteous from the very beginning, compared with the sinners who are latecomers. But the Lord wanted to bless everyone, with even the least kind of people, the sinners, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the criminals who were repenting. Verse 26, when David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to the elders of Yehudah who were his friends, saying, here's a gift for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies. Wow. He did not only share his plunder, his loot, to his fellow people in Ziklag, but also to his fellow Israelis, Yehudis. Arriving in Ziklag was the most relieving moment for all of them. We're home at last. We can rest. He was glad to see his friends. And David had enough to share more, even those who did not participate in the rescue effort. Now, how would you feel if you did not receive any share? You'd feel bad, right? Right. But David was just so overwhelmed. He wanted to give as many gifts as he could to people, even those who were not even involved in the situation. How would you feel if somebody blesses you, even if you did not help at all? You would be very grateful. Oh, wow. Thank you. But why? Because David's gifts came from the Lord. So if you receive gift from the Lord, share your gifts. Right? Last verses, David sent it to those who were in Bethel, Ramoth Negev, and Yatir, to those in Aroer, Sifmoth, Eshtemoa, and Rachal, to those in the towns of Yerachmeelis and Dakenis, to those in Korma, Bor Ashan, Atak, and Hebron, and to those in all the other places where he and his men had roamed. Wow. So imagine at the surprise of the people from different places receiving unexpected gifts. What happened? Why are we receiving gifts? David won the battle. He was a great hero. This confirms that David was not their enemy, even though he fought for the Philistines temporarily. And he was still their champion. He was still a Yehudi, an Israeli. This sharing of goods from the victory assured the Yehudis and the Israelis that David was still their champion. What a great story, right? Wonderful story. Let's review our lessons for today. Strength to recover and to retrieve. He got it from the Lord. Renew with the Lord's strength when in great distress. Rather than ranting, crying all night, go straight to the Lord. Seek the Lord's will before acting or doing anything else. Follow the Lord's providence to fulfill your mission. Fight the Lord's battle until victory is achieved. And share the Lord's victory for all to rejoice. What a beautiful story. Now, I want you to think about this. What losses have you incurred lately? That you're asking the Lord, Lord, can you please restore these things? Maybe it's your health. Maybe it's an opportunity, a business or a job or whatever. Do you believe that God can still bless you with more? Will you believe that God can use unexpected people to guide you, just like that Egyptian guy where you needed to go? That's God's providence. You can get help from people you don't expect to help you out, even strangers. Even you have just met right there. You haven't met that person before. God can use that as providence. Can you be a leader like David, a man of faith who gets his strength from the Lord? Get your strength from the Lord, huh? And a champion of the oppressed and a generous giver to all. What a great story.